Dear listeners, today we bring you a captivating tale that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Agatha Christie's Mystery at the Gala, a tale that's packed with mystery, suspense, and just the right amount of drama. But before we dive into this thrilling detective story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss out on more exciting tales like this one. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the adventure that awaits. The Mystery at the Gala is one of Agatha Christie's earlier short stories, featuring the renowned detective Hercule Poirot. First published in 1923, this story takes us back to post-World War I England, a time when lavish parties and masquerades were all the rage as people sought a bit of escape from the grim realities of the war. Picture this: a grand victory ball where high society gathers to celebrate and forget. Christie's rich setting captures this social fascination perfectly, adding layers of intrigue and glamour that truly make the ball feel alive. But there's more to this than just opulence. The ball's costumes, based on the Italian Commedia dell'arte, add a dramatic twist to the mystery, making it not just a crime to solve, but a performance in itself. This blending of theater and reality gives us more than just a typical detective story. It's a reflection of the theatrical world that was making its own comeback in those days. A world full of masks, both literal and figurative. Now, how did Poirot, Belgium's finest detective, get involved in this particular case? It was no coincidence, that's for sure. His fame from solving the Styles case had catapulted him to international recognition, and after the war, he decided to turn his attention to solving the most puzzling crimes. His sharp mind, honed through war and years of observation, led him to this strange and sensational case that everyone was talking about. And I, as his loyal friend, was right by his side, observing every move as he unraveled the mystery. It was a crisp spring morning when I found myself in Poirot's London apartment, watching him delicately apply a new pomade to his signature mustache. Always neat, always methodical. I had my mind on the latest headlines, and it was clear that the mystery at the Gala was all anyone could talk about. Who had killed Lord Cronshaw? Was Coco Court's death truly a tragic accident, or was something far darker at play? As I pondered these questions aloud, Poirot, ever the perfectionist, was more focused on the marvel of his mustache pomade than the case. But after a moment's distraction, he was quick to snap back to reality and ask the very questions I had been grappling with. And just as we were about to discuss further, the door opened and in walked an old friend, Inspector Japp from Scotland Yard, ready to offer us a chance to dig deeper into this intriguing mystery. Now, let's talk about those costumes. Oh, they were nothing short of spectacular. They weren't just any costumes, they were inspired by a set of rare china figures from Eustace Bain's prized collection. Lord Cronshaw, in his harlequin getup, and his uncle, Eustace Boleyn, played the role of Punchinello. Mrs. Malaby, with her sparkling charm, matched him as Pinella. The Davidsons were Piero and Pierrette, adding an air of mystery to the evening, and of course, Miss Courtney, our captivating heroine, was Colin. A masquerade ball like no other, where everyone was cloaked in their finest costumes, but not everything was as it seemed beneath the glittering masks. As the evening unfolded, a certain unease settled over Lord Cronshaw. His mood darkened, and a strange tension filled the air. When the party gathered for supper in a small private room, it was clear something was terribly wrong. Lord Cronshaw, typically the life of the party, had become distant, his demeanor as cold as the stone walls of the hall. Miss Courtney, who had been in tears earlier, was barely holding herself together, on the brink of hysteria. The tension was palpable. Everyone at the table noticed. There were no warm exchanges, no laughter, just an uncomfortable silence that hung over the meal like a heavy fog. As the evening wore on, Miss Courtney's discomfort grew. She turned to Chris Davidson, a young actor and a close friend, and, audibly, for everyone to hear, asked him to take her home. She had had enough of the ball. Poor Chris hesitated, glancing nervously at Lord Cronshaw, whose mood was so dark it could have soured the wine. But eventually he relented, escorting Miss Courtney back to her flat, where her words echoed in his ears. "I'll make old Cronshaw pay for this." That ominous remark was the only hint we had that her death might not have been an accident. Still, there was precious little to go on. By the time Chris had calmed her down and helped her to bed, it was far too late to return to the Colossus Hall. The night had taken a dreadful turn, and Chris, shaken, went home to his own flat in Chelsea. Little did he know that by morning his life would be forever changed. Meanwhile, back at the ball, Lord Cronshaw's behavior grew even more erratic. He kept to himself, avoiding his guests. As the clock struck 1:30 a.m., just before the grand unmasking ceremony, Captain Digby, an old officer who knew Cronshaw well, spotted him standing alone in a box, gazing down at the crowd with a faraway look. "Come on, Cronshaw, what's got into you?" Digby called, waving him down. "Stop moping like a boiled owl. There's a good old rag coming up." But when Cronshaw didn't respond, Digby grew impatient. "Does he think we're going to wait for him all night?" he muttered. Just as he was about to leave, Mrs. Mallaby, ever the vivacious widow, joined them and suggested they go after Cronshaw. "Let's go and rout him out," she said, her eyes sparkling with mischief. They searched the hall but came up empty-handed, until Mrs. Mallaby had a hunch that he might be in the room where they'd had supper earlier. And when they arrived, they found him, lying lifeless on the floor, a table knife lodged in his heart. A chilling sight. The once vibrant harlequin now reduced to a cold, silent figure. "8?" Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Ah, yes, Punchinello. A rather peculiar costume, don't you think? But I suppose I mustn't focus on that just yet." His voice dripped with the faintest hint of mockery, but the inspector was too caught up in the details to notice. Poirot's eyes gleamed with the sharpness of a hawk. "Tell me, did they send for a doctor immediately?" The inspector nodded. Of course, but by the time he arrived, there was nothing that could be done. The death must have been instantaneous. Poirot's mind seemed to be working furiously, but he only nodded in acknowledgement. "I understand, but tell me, did the doctor mention anything unusual in his testimony? Was there anything about the appearance of the body that struck him as abnormal?" The inspector hesitated, clearly unsure of where Poirot was going with this. "Well, now that you mention it, yes. The doctor did remark on the tension and stiffness in Lord Cronshaw's limbs. He couldn't quite explain it, but it was certainly out of the ordinary." Poirot's lips curled into a knowing smile. "Aha!" he exclaimed softly. "Now that gives one pause, doesn't it?" The inspector looked bewildered. "What are you getting at, Poirot? Are you suggesting poisoning?" Poirot's eyes sparkled with the brilliance of a mind already miles ahead. Poison? But who would poison a man, only to then stab him with a knife? Ridiculous, isn't it? The inspector was about to argue, but Poirot was already placidly waving his hand. No, I agree. Poisoning is not the answer." There was a pause before Poirot continued, as if savoring the mystery. "Now, is there anything else you wish to show me? Perhaps the room where Lord Cronshaw's body was found?" The inspector shook his head. "Not necessary, Poirot. You've already heard everything important." Poirot's face softened as he turned his attention to something else, his voice laced with curiosity. "I'm interested in one more thing, Lord Cronshaw's views on drug use. The inspector looked at him, confused. Drug use? What does that have to do with the murder? Poirot smiled cryptically. Ah, my good friend, the pieces are not always as obvious as they seem. But tell me, is there one other thing I could examine? The inspector nodded. What is it? Poirot's eyes gleamed with purpose. The set of china figurines from which the costumes were inspired. The inspector stared at him, somewhat incredulously. You're a curious one, Poirot, but fine, if you must. I'll make arrangements. And so, they made their way to Berkeley Square. When they arrived at the residence, they were told that Lord Cronshaw's uncle was not home. However, at the inspector's request, they were shown into the room where the china figurines were displayed. A collection of rare and delicate pieces, said to be priceless. Poirot, ever the master of details, was already at work. He murmured, as he studied the figurines on the shelf. The old Italian comedy, Harlequin and Colline, Piero and Pierrette, Pinella and Punchinello. He nodded appreciatively, his eyes flicking from one figure to the next. Very elaborate, very detailed. The inspector looked on, clearly puzzled. I don't see how this has anything to do with the case, Poirot. Poirot didn't answer right away. Instead, he carefully replaced the figurines and stepped down from his perch. No, it's not quite right, he muttered, but it is important. Just then, the door opened, and the new Lord Cronshaw, Eustace Belaine, entered. He was a suave man of about 50, his manner languid, his face handsome but clearly bearing the marks of a dissolute life. The inspector immediately felt a wave of unease wash over him. Something about the man rubbed him the wrong way. Lord Cronshaw. Poirot greeted him, his voice smooth, but his eyes searching. The new Lord Cronshaw, with an air of practiced indifference, greeted them warmly. I've heard great things about your skills, Monsieur Poirot. Please, do make yourselves at home. He gestured for them to sit. The police are doing all they can, but I fear the mystery of my nephew's death will never be solved. It's utterly baffling. Poirot studied him with quiet intensity. Your nephew had no enemies, then? He asked, his voice cutting through the thick air of the room. Lord Cronshaw looked uncomfortable. None that I'm aware of, he answered quickly, his eyes darting away. After a brief pause, he added, But if there are questions you'd like to ask, please, ask only one. Poirot leaned forward, his eyes glinting with purpose. The costumes, he said simply. They were reproduced exactly from your figurines, down to the smallest detail. Why? Milo looked at Poirot with a mixture of disbelief and sudden clarity. That is all I wanted to know, Poirot, he said, the weight lifting from his shoulders. I wish you good day. He turned to leave, but Poirot's voice stopped him in his tracks. What next, mon ami? Poirot asked, his voice calm, yet carrying that unmistakable undercurrent of intrigue. Milo hesitated, clearly eager to be off. I've got to report at the yard, you know, but I won't detain you. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. I have one last little matter to attend to, and then... Yes, the case will be complete. Milo stopped in his tracks, his eyes widening. You don't mean it, Poirot. You know who killed Lord Cronshaw. Poirot's lips curled into a slight smile. Ah, mon ami, you know my little weakness, he replied, his tone filled with that characteristic twinkle. I like to keep the threads in my own hands, up until the very last moment. But rest assured, I will reveal all when the time is right. Milo shook his head in disbelief. So, you do know. Poirot chuckled softly. Have no fear, the affair will be yours, on the condition that you permit me to play out the denouement my way. Milo's brows furrowed in confusion. Fair enough, he said, but with a half-hearted tone. "That is, if the denouement ever comes." Poirot smiled cryptically. "Ah, but it will come, mon ami. It always does." Milo, still somewhat perplexed, waved a hand as he turned. "I'm off to the yard, then. Goodbye for now, Poirot." Poirot watched him go, and then, with an air of calm certainty, he hailed a passing taxi. "Where are we going now?" I asked, my curiosity piqued by his sudden shift in focus. "To Chelsea," Poirot replied with a decisive air, handing the driver an address. "To see the Davidsons." As we sat back in the cab, the quiet hum of the city around us, I couldn't help but ask, "What do you think of the new Lord Cronshaw?" Poirot glanced at me, his face unreadable. "What says my good friend Hastings?" he asked, his tone almost teasing. I couldn't hide my instinctive distrust of the man. "I don't trust him. I think he's the wicked uncle of the storybooks." Poirot smiled softly. "Ah, but you are mistaken, mon ami. He is not quite what you think. He is amiable, yes, but he has his reasons." I stared at him, baffled. "What do you mean?" Poirot looked at me, his expression filled with subtle sadness. "No method, mon ami," he murmured cryptically. "No method at all." When we arrived at the Davidsons' residence in Chelsea, the building itself was unremarkable. Just another block of mansion flats. The third floor. Mrs. Davidson was home, but her husband was not. We were ushered into a long, dimly lit room with garish oriental hangings that gave the space an oppressive air. The scent of incense hung thick in the air, cloying and overwhelming. Mrs. Davidson appeared almost immediately, her delicate frame making her seem fragile, almost painfully so. But there was something unsettling in her light blue eyes, a sharp, calculating gleam that made me uneasy. Poirot explained our connection to the case, and Mrs. Davidson's face softened with an almost theatrical sorrow. "Poor Cronshaw," she said, her voice trembling as if she might faint. "And poor Coco, too. We were both so fond of him. His death has been a terrible grief to us." I could see through the act, though. There was something about her that didn't quite add up. Poirot, ever the master of handling delicate situations, didn't rush her. "Madam," he said smoothly, "I would not harass your feelings unnecessarily. Inspector has told me all that is needful. I only wish to see the costume you wore at the ball that night." She blinked, clearly surprised by the request. "The costume?" she echoed, her voice uncertain. "You want to see the costume?" Poirot, never one to miss a beat, continued smoothly. "You comprehend, madame, that I work with the methods of my country. There, we always reconstruct the crime. It is possible that I may need an actual representation of the scene. If so, you understand, the costumes are very important." Mrs. Davidson hesitated, still looking unsure. "I've heard of reconstructing a crime," she said, her voice wavering. "But I didn't know you were so particular about details." Poirot's charm was effortless as always. "Details, madame, make the difference between a good reconstruction and the perfect one." After a brief moment of indecision, Mrs. Davidson sighed and nodded. "I'll fetch the dress," she said, rising from her seat. She returned quickly with a delicate wisp of white satin and green, an exquisite gown. Poirot took it from her hands and examined it with the same intensity he applied to every clue. After a few moments he handed it back to her with a bow. "Marry, madame," he said, his voice soft but filled with an undertone of knowing. "I see you have had the misfortune to lose one of your green pom-poms, the one on the shoulder here." Mrs. Davidson's eyes widened in surprise. "Oh, yes," she said quickly. "It got torn off at the ball. I picked it up and gave it to poor Lord Cronshaw to keep for me." Poirot's gaze never left her face as he leaned in, his voice low. "That was after supper, I presume." Her expression faltered for just a split second before she recovered. Yes, that's right," she replied, almost too quickly. "Not long before the tragedy, a bit before, in fact." Poirot's keen eyes never missed a detail, and I could see that the small hesitation in her answer had already begun to unravel the mystery in his mind. "Fascinating," Poirot murmured, his voice drifting off as if lost in thought. "Fascinating indeed." But Mrs. Davidson, perhaps sensing something was off, suddenly seemed to grow anxious. "Oh, Monsieur Poirot, must we really go over all of that dreadful evening again?" Her voice shook, and there was a subtle change in her demeanor. Poirot smiled gently, but didn't let the moment slip by unnoticed. "Ah, madame, you must understand. It is all necessary for the truth to come out. In time, the pieces will fall into place." The tension in the room thickened, but Poirot seemed unfazed. He had his answers, and he was ready to tie up the loose ends. But what lay ahead? The game was far from over, and the final twist was still waiting to be revealed. "Well," I said with a sly smile, "that explains everything." Poirot paused, his face lighting up with the familiar gleam in his eyes. "Indeed, Hastings, a true deduction of simplicity. But I must say the most intriguing part is not the case itself. It's how one can so easily overlook the obvious. For instance, consider the two key tragedies, the death of Lord Cronshaw and Miss Courtenay." I leaned forward, my curiosity piqued. "You mean the connection between them?" Poirot nodded slowly, steepling his fingers. "Exactly. Miss Courtenay's tragic demise wasn't just a random poisoning. Number It was cleverly orchestrated, intentionally masked as something else. The cocaine poisoning, for example, came not from her own stash but from someone else entirely." My mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place. "Davidson," I exclaimed. "He must have supplied her with the drug." "Precisely," Poirot said, a glint of satisfaction in his voice. "And while Lord Cronshaw might have suspected this, it was his knowledge that brought him to the truth. He confronted Miss Courtenay about the drugs. Davidson, fearing exposure, did the unthinkable. He decided to silence Cronshaw forever." "But wait," I added, still trying to make sense of the full picture. "If Lord Cronshaw died so soon after their confrontation, how could Davidson possibly know how to stage everything so perfectly?" Poirot smiled gently, as if amused by my struggle. "That, mon ami, is the true art of misdirection. Davidson, being an actor, could seamlessly blend in and play his part. The perfect harlequin. He slipped into the ball disguised, hiding his true intentions until it was too late for Lord Cronshaw." I sat back in my chair, astounded by the level of manipulation at play. "But what about the curtain, the recess where you believed the body was hidden?" Poirot's eyes twinkled with pride. "Ah, yes, that was the final clue. Everyone overlooked the simple fact that waiters were in and out of that small room, making it seem unlikely that the body would have just been left there. It had to be hidden temporarily, in a place so inconspicuous that no one would question it. A simple recess behind the curtain, just waiting for Davidson to move the body after creating a diversion." "Unbelievable," I whispered. "Davidson was clever, extremely clever." Poirot nodded, his expression almost serene. "Yes, but not quite as clever as Hercule Poirot." As the pieces clicked together in my mind, I marveled at the sheer brilliance of Poirot's deduction. It was a case that had baffled many, yet, with his unique method of observation, he had unraveled the truth. But as he beamed proudly, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of admiration mixed with a sense of awe. In this game of wits, Poirot was always one step ahead. Thank you very much for listening to this thrilling tale, narrated by Rami. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and make sure to leave your thoughts in the comments below.